The monitors screamed first, a synchronized chorus of impending death, rolling through St. Jude's emergency bay like a warning siren no one could switch off. 50 trauma patients, 5 surgical suites, 3 hours, and a body count that, by every reasonable measure, should have been impossible to survive. Panic swept the halls that night. Everyone lost their footing, except one person, a quiet scrub nurse who simply tied her mask, picked up a scalpel, and quietly rewrote the rules of what one person could do. Winter in Chicago is rarely gentle, but the blizzard that hit on the eve of November 14th wasn't just unforgiving. It was merciless. Ice crept over the interstate in an invisible sheet, turning the evening commute into a death trap disguised as pavement. A jackknifed semi triggered a 60-car pileup on I-90. In 30 minutes flat, St. Jude's Memorial went from a quiet evening shift to a war zone. At the center of it stood Dr. Rollins Webb, chief of surgery, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Webb was a man who demanded perfection, and, more often than not, got it. The kind of surgeon who carried the quiet arrogance of someone who had never lost a patient he cared enough to save. He ruled his floor with an iron fist, but as the ER doors blew open again and again, spitting snow and screaming paramedics into the sterile white corridor, even Webb felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: genuine terror. The hospital was dangerously understaffed. 3 of his top attendings were stranded across the city, their cars buried under snowdrifts they'd never dig out in time. What remained in the building was Webb himself, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Samuel Tatry, 2 terrified first-year residents, and a handful of nurses running on fumes. Among them was Audrey Collins. She'd transferred to St. Jude's surgical ward 8 months earlier. At 34, she was the kind of nurse the doctors barely noticed. Soft-spoken, eyes down, always a half step ahead of what a surgeon needed before he asked for it. Webb thought of her, when he thought of her at all, as a glorified instrument passer, competent, quiet, replaceable. She never joined the gossip at the nurses' station, never talked about her past, and carried a weight in her posture that nobody had ever bothered to ask about. "Listen to me," Webb's voice cut clean through the wails of a woman with a crushed sternum. "Triage protocols are in full effect. Black tags get morphine and a quiet corner. Red tags go straight to the ORs. Adler, Jenkins, you 2 are stepping up, whether you like it or not. I'm taking the descending aortic rupture in OR1, 3 hours, maybe 4. You take the abdominal traumas in 2 and 3. Dr. Timothy Adler, 26, and looking more like a teenager by the second, swallowed hard enough that his Adam's apple visibly bobbed. "Sir, I've never done an exploratory laparotomy on my own. I need supervision." "You don't have supervision." Webb grabbed a fistful of his scrubs. "You have your textbook knowledge, and you have a pulse. Keep them alive until I'm out of OR1, or so help me God, I will end your career before it starts." Audrey stood at the scrub sink, methodically washing to the elbow, her face unreadable beneath a blue surgical cap. She watched Adler tremble. She watched Dr. Sarah Jenkins hyperventilate in the corner. She watched Webb disappear into OR1, leaving the rest of the ward in the hands of 2 children wearing oversized scrubs. The casualty count kept climbing. Within 10 minutes, all 4 remaining ORs were occupied by patients in freefall. Anesthesiologists sprinted between rooms, pushing sedatives into bodies that couldn't wait for a surgeon who wasn't coming. "Nurse Collins!" Dr. Tatry's voice cracked through the doors of OR2, tight with panic. "Get in here. We're losing him." Audrey pushed through. On the table lay a man in his 40s, his abdomen swollen and bruised a violent shade of purple, the monitor screaming an erratic rhythm as his blood pressure plummeted. 60 over 40 and falling. Adler stood over him, scalpel trembling in his hand, completely frozen. The internal bleeding was a ticking bomb, and Adler didn't even know where to make the first cut. "Adler, cut!" Tatry barked from behind the anesthesia drape. "His pressure's dropping. He's bleeding into his peritoneum. Open him and clamp the bleed." I can't!" Adler's eyes were wide, terrified. "If I cut blind, I could sever the bowel. I need Webb." "Webb is chest deep in a thoracic blowout. Do your job." The monitor let out a long, high shriek. 50/30. He was crashing. Audrey crossed to the other side of the table. No shouting, no panic. Just a gloved hand, moving with smooth, terrifying certainty, gently but firmly lifting the scalpel out of Adler's fingers. What are you doing?" he stammered, stepping back. "Dr. Adler?" Her voice dropped an octave, suddenly carrying an authority that seemed to bend the tile walls around it. "Take the suction. Dr. Tatry, push 2 units of O negative and give me 10 of epi. Now." Tatry blinked, stunned by the shift in the room, but the command in her voice hit some deep professional reflex. Pushing epi. Audrey didn't hesitate. She pressed the blade to the man's abdomen and drew a flawless, deep, perfectly straight line from the xiphoid to the pubis. A textbook midline laparotomy, executed with the speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Blood welled instantly, dark and thick, pooling into the open cavity. "Suction, Dr. Adler!" When he froze again, staring at the nurse who had just detonated every protocol in the hospital's handbook, her eyes snapped up and locked onto his. "I said suction, Timothy, unless you'd like to sign his death certificate." That broke the spell. He plunged the tube into the wound. As the blood cleared, Audrey's hands moved into the cavity, not fumbling, not searching, but navigating the ruined anatomy with an eerie, mechanical grace. Ruptured splenic artery. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. "Retractor. Hold this, Adler. Pull back, hard." He obeyed, his mind spinning in a daze, watching the soft-spoken scrub nurse guide a pair of Kelly clamps deep into the fascia and close them on the bleeding artery blind, working entirely by touch. The bleeding stopped instantly. "Vitals?" Tatry stared at his monitors, jaw hanging open behind his mask. Pressures stabilizing, 90/60 and climbing, heart rates coming down. He looked up, eyes wide. "Collins, what did you just do?" "I saved his life." Her tone stayed flat. "Adler, ligate the artery. I'm checking the bowel for perforations. We have 4 more patients dying down the hall, and we don't have time to stand here." For the next 45 minutes, Adler wasn't the surgeon in that room. He was Audrey's hands and eyes, following instructions he couldn't fully process, watching her suture with a speed his own eyes could barely track. Knots tight, clean, flawless. She closed the abdomen in record time. Before he could even strip off his bloody gloves, the intercom crackled to life. "OR3, patient in V-fib. Major Jenkins is freezing." Audrey didn't say a word. She spun, kicked the door open, and sprinted down the corridor. Tatry left a junior nurse to watch the stabilized patient and ran after her. Inside OR3, it was a nightmare. A young woman lay on the table, her chest cavity crushed, while Dr. Sarah Jenkins stood backed against the wall, hyperventilating, the monitor screaming the flat tone of cardiac arrest. "Ooh-hoo! She has a tension pneumothorax," Jenkins sobbed. "I tried to needle decompress. I missed, and her heart just stopped." Audrey reached the table. Dr. Tatry grabbed the paddles, charged to 200. She didn't wait for Jenkins. She seized a heavy scalpel and drove it into the chest wall between the ribs, slicing through muscle in one brutal, calculated stroke, then grabbed a chest tube off the tray and jammed it into the pleural cavity. A massive hiss of trapped air, a geyser of dark blood, and the pressure crushing the woman's heart, released all at once. "Clear!" Tatry pressed the paddles to her chest. The body convulsed upward. The monitor stayed flat. "Charge to 300. Push 1 of epi." Tatry charged again. "Clear." Another shock. The monitor hesitated, sputtered, and then caught a ragged, beautiful rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. "We have a pulse." Tatry stared across the table at Audrey, like he was looking at an apparition. "Nurse Collins, who the hell are you?" She ignored him entirely. "Dr. Jenkins, scrub in. We need to stabilize this femur fracture before she throws a fat embolus. I'll walk you through an external fixation." Over the next 2 hours, something impossible unfolded in the surgical wing of St. Jude's. Audrey Collins moved like a phantom between OR 2, 3, 4, and 5, commanding the chaos with something close to military precision. In OR 4, she performed a complex craniotomy to relieve a subdural hematoma, guiding the drill with hands that looked carved from marble. In OR 5, she found a shattered femoral artery by instinct alone, working blind in a pool of blood. She didn't just assist the residents. She operated through them, ordering them to hold retractors and tie sutures, while every critical incision, every life-saving decision, belonged to her. Tatri watched in a state of reverent shock. The speed, the economy of movement, the absolute absence of hesitation. These weren't the instincts of a nurse, or even an exceptional one. These were the hallmarks of a surgeon, forged in the bloodiest, most desperate theaters medicine has to offer. Exactly 3 hours and 14 minutes after the ER doors first blew open, silence finally settled over the surgical floor. The frantic beeping stopped. The shouting stopped. 5 patients who should have died on arrival were stable, sutured, and rolling into the ICU. Down the hall, the doors of OR1 swung open, and Dr. Rollins Webb emerged, looking like he'd been through a meat grinder. Scrubs soaked through, cap askew, 3 hours of fighting an aortic dissection behind his eyes. He had walked in believing he'd save 1 life, while the other 4 inevitably slipped away. He braced for grieving families, for body bags in the hallway. Instead, he found silence, and an empty, spotless nurses' station. Frowning, he walked to the whiteboard where trauma cases were tracked, expecting 4 red lines through 4 names, the universal mark of a death on the table. Instead, next to all 5 names, in neat blue marker, post-op ICU, stable. Webb froze. "What is this?" he muttered. "Where are the bodies?" He found them through the ICU observation window. 5 beds, 5 steady heartbeats on the monitors, chest tubes placed with precision, external fixators aligned like something out of a textbook. At the charting desk, Adler sat staring blankly into a cup of cold coffee, hollow-eyed. "Adler." Webb slammed a hand on the desk. "What happened here? Did the storm break? Did Vance or Sterling make it in?" "No, sir." Adler's voice was flat. "Nobody made it in." "Then who did this?" Webb jabbed a finger at the surgical log glowing on the screen. "This laparotomy took 22 minutes, first cut to closure. This burr hole is perfectly placed. You don't have the hands for this, Adler. Who operated on my floor?" Adler raised a shaking finger toward the scrub room at the end of the hall. Through the glass, Webb saw her. Cap off, dark hair loose over her shoulders, scrubbing dried blood from beneath her fingernails with the same unreadable calm she'd carried 3 hours earlier. A cold chill moved down his spine. He crossed the hallway and pushed open the door. "They're telling me you guided them," he said, voice trembling somewhere between rage and disbelief. "Adler's trying to convince me a 34-year-old scrub nurse just performed 5 masterclass trauma surgeries at once." She didn't look up. Dr. Adler did excellent work holding the retractors. "I looked at the incisions, Collins, the suturing. I've been chief of surgery for 15 years, and I couldn't have moved that fast. Those weren't the hands of a nurse." He stepped closer, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. "Who are you? Who the hell are you, really?" Audrey didn't flinch. She turned off the water, dried her hands, and finally met his eyes, cold, steady, and entirely without fear. "I'm a registered nurse at this hospital, Dr. Webb." Her tone stayed perfectly even. Under the state's Good Samaritan laws and the emergency triage protocols activated during a mass casualty event, medical personnel are authorized to take life-saving action when a physician is unavailable. The patients were dying. I intervened. Webb let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Intervened? You didn't apply a tourniquet, Collins. You clamped a splenic artery blind. You performed an emergency thoracotomy and an external fixation with the muscle memory of an attending trauma surgeon who's seen 1,000 casualties. Don't insult my intelligence. The patients are alive." She clipped her ID back onto her scrubs. "That's the only fact that matters tonight. My shift ended 20 minutes ago." She walked past him, leaving the chief of surgery alone in the damp scrub room, his certainty in ruins. Webb didn't go home. He went straight to the hospital's administrative archives, a man who needed to understand the mechanics of everything around him, and Audrey Collins had just become a mechanical impossibility. He found Dr. Tatry in the physician's lounge, staring blankly at a muted television, still trying to process what he'd watched. Tatry. Webb dropped a legal pad on the table. Every instrument she asked for, every term she used, the way she tied her sutures. I want it all. Rollins, she saved them, all of them. Adler was about to let that man bleed out. I know she saved them. Webb paced the room. But nurses don't wake up one day knowing how to decompress a tension pneumothorax with a raw scalpel blade. She has training, elite training. I want to know who's operating in my hospital. By dawn, the storm had finally broken, burying Chicago under 2 feet of snow. Inside, Webb and Tatry cut through the bureaucratic layers of Audrey's personnel file. On the surface, it was aggressively ordinary. A nursing degree from an unremarkable state college, generic letters of recommendation, a quiet, spotless work history. But Tatry, whose brother worked in federal medical licensing, caught something. A 5-year employment gap, sealed under a Department of Defense mandate. Calling in a favor that would take years to repay, Tatry ran her fingerprints, on file for her nursing license, through a federal military database. When the record decrypted on the screen, both men stopped breathing. Military record, classified clearance, medical division, name, Dr. Audrey Collins, MD, fax, rank, Major, United States Army Medical Command, education, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, valedictorian, specialty, cardiothoracic and severe trauma surgery, deployment, lead surgeon, forward operating base Salerno, Afghanistan. Webb stared at the screen, every trace of arrogance draining out of him, replaced by something closer to awe. Audrey Collins wasn't just a surgeon. She was one of the most decorated combat surgeons the United States military had. Look at her logs. Tatry's finger trembled against the screen. During the 2018 offensive, she performed 340 surgeries in a single month. She was the sole attending for a Tier 1 Special Operations unit. She practically invented a field method for repairing ruptured aortas in an active combat zone. Then why, Webb asked, leaning in, is a world-class trauma surgeon passing instruments to first-year residents in Chicago? Tatry scrolled to the final entry. The sterile language couldn't hide the tragedy underneath it. On August 12, 2019, a suicide bomber breached the perimeter of FOB Salerno, the medical tent filled with 30 critically wounded soldiers in minutes. Major Collins operated for 22 hours straight. She saved 12 men. In the 13th hour, they brought in a young infantry lieutenant with catastrophic shrapnel wounds to the chest, her younger brother, First Lieutenant David Collins. She operated on him herself, opened his chest, held his failing heart in her bare hands, fought for 2 agonizing hours to stitch his shredded arteries back together. She lost him. He died on her table, his blood soaking into her scrubs. According to the psychiatric evaluation in her file, something in her broke that day. The weight of deciding who lived and who died had finally become more than she could carry. She was honorably discharged, surrendered her medical license, and disappeared into civilian life as a nurse. A role where she could still heal, still touch medicine, but would never again have to make the final call. Webb sat back and dragged a hand over his face, remembering 8 months of barking orders at her, dismissing her, treating her like hospital furniture. He'd spent 8 months patronizing a woman who had forgotten more about trauma surgery than he'd ever learn. The morning shattered further when Arthur Pendleton, CEO of St. Jude's Memorial, stormed onto the surgical floor flanked by 2 attorneys. Pendleton didn't see 5 saved lives. He saw a lawsuit with teeth. Word had reached the executive suite that a registered nurse had performed 5 unauthorized major surgeries, and to him, that was an apocalyptic legal exposure. I want her terminated. Immediately, Pendleton hissed, cornering Webb in his office. And I want the police called. Practicing medicine without a license is a felony. If the board finds out we let a scrub nurse perform craniotomies, they'll shut this whole wing down. Webb rose slowly. For the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about his own name on the door. You'll do no such thing, Arthur. Rollins, she violated every protocol in the handbook. She saved 5 lives. Webb slammed the surgical reports on the desk. Look at these charts. If she'd waited 5 more minutes for me to clear OR1, all 5 of them would be in the morgue right now. I won't let you crucify the best surgeon in this building to protect your premiums. She's a nurse! She's Major Audrey Collins. Webb threw her unredacted military file across the desk. Former Chief of Trauma at FOB Salerno, Johns Hopkins valedictorian, more combat surgical experience than our entire attending staff put together. Before Pendleton could finish processing the paperwork, the office door clicked open. Audrey stood in the frame, out of her scrubs and into a plain winter coat, her face pale but resolute. She'd heard the shouting from down the hall. Dr. Webb. Her voice was quiet. Mr. Pendleton, you don't need to fight. I've already typed up my resignation. I'll speak to the police myself. Nobody's going to the police. Webb stepped out from behind his desk, all the usual arrogance stripped from his posture. I read your file, Dr. Collins. I know about Salerno. I know about your brother. Her breath caught. For the first time all night, a crack opened in her armor. Her eyes dropped to the floor as the ghost of her past filled the room. I couldn't do it anymore, she whispered. The pressure, the expectation that I could fix anything. When David died, I realized I wasn't God. I was just a mechanic, playing with human lives. I became a nurse because I wanted to care for people without holding their survival in my hands. But you held their survival in your hands last night, Webb said gently. When the moment came, you didn't freeze. You didn't run. You stepped up to that table because it's exactly who you are. You're a surgeon, Audrey. You can hide in oversized scrubs and pass instruments all you like, but that scalpel belongs in your hand. Pendleton, glancing between the military file and the obvious PR value of a decorated war hero saving 5 lives in a blizzard, changed course fast. If what Dr. Webb says is true, Ms. Collins, the board might view this as an extreme emergency intervention. But you can't stay here as a nurse. The liability's too high. She won't be staying as a nurse. Webb turned to Pendleton with a look that left no room for argument. She's taking the medical boards to reinstate her civilian license, and when she passes, she becomes my new deputy chief of surgery, or I walk. Audrey stared at him, stunned. Dr. Webb, I don't know if I can lead a surgical team again. You already did. He allowed himself a faint smile. Adler's about ready to build you a shrine in the residence lounge. That afternoon, the blizzard finally broke, giving way to brilliant, blinding winter light. Audrey walked slowly down the ICU corridor and stopped outside the glass window of room 3. The young woman with the crushed chest was awake, bruised, wired to a dozen machines, but breathing, alive. Beside her bed, her husband wept quietly, holding her hand. Audrey pressed her palm to the cold glass. The guilt that had anchored her to the past for 5 years didn't vanish. Grief rarely does. But watching that monitor beep out a strong, steady rhythm, something in the weight shifted. For the first time since she lost her brother, she felt the quiet pull of the operating room again, not as a place where she'd failed, but as a sanctuary of life. She turned and walked back toward the surgical wing. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. The ghost of Salerno had finally come home. If this story of hidden skill, unbearable sacrifice, and hard-won redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, share this video with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe to Beyond the Silence Tales for more breathtaking, real-life medical dramas. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Audrey's shoes. Your support helps us bring more untold, heroic stories to light.
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. She completed 5 surgeries in 3 hours. The chief surgeon froze. Who are you? I'd really love to know what you think of this one. How did the story make you feel? What stuck with me was the idea that real skill and dedication often speak louder than first impressions. Sometimes the people we underestimate have the most to offer. Which moment surprised you the most? And what do you think this story was really trying to say about earning respect? If it left you with something to reflect on, let it be a reminder to keep an open mind and appreciate the quiet strength people carry every day. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, feel free to like or subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.